All right, welcome everybody. Today we are going to talk about advanced form permissions and scripting. Scripting is an interesting topic in OpenAir because it's something that is a fairly recent feature. Not a lot of companies are taking advantage of it yet, so I will give you a nice introduction to that feature. But first we're going to run through all the different options with form permissions. There are a lot of new features, so even though you may be familiar with form permissions and permission rules, you may be less familiar with some of the more recent enhancements that have come out last year relating to those. So we're going to look at those first. All right. First of all, form permissions. So when I say form permissions, sometimes I want to be really specific what we're talking about here. When you go into any form in OpenAir, there will be an option, I should say almost any form. In the new UI we're just going to be looking at today, most of you are on that already. If you open up a record and you click on this gray button and you're an administrator and you're on a form that has form permissions, typically it'll be the project properties form, you'll see an option for modify the form permissions. Now everything that shows up there, technically we could group that all into one category and say that's form permissions. I tend to think about it just a little bit differently though, and I look at these sections that are role-based. I tend to think of those as form permissions. So things like hiding buttons for a particular role, making fields required, hidden, or read-only for a particular role, and then hiding sections by role. So I think of these as role-based permissions as opposed to permission rules, which we're going to be treating as a separate topic, and scripts, which we'll also be treating as a separate topic. So when I say form permissions, I tend to think of them as role-based permissions versus permission rules. So specifically, let's cover the role-based permissions first to see what's available. I just covered it, disabling the delete and save button. So if you want to give somebody the permission to view records but not modify them or delete them, you can do it that way. You can make fields required, read-only, or hidden by role. And then this option, some of you may not see this, especially if you've been on OpenAir for quite a while, to actually hide sections. This hidden divider sections option, it's not a new feature, but if you went live on OpenAir years ago, this may or may not have been enabled when you went live. So if you don't see this, be sure that you request that and add that. Every once in a while I'll still come across somebody who doesn't have that enabled, so just an FYI, you can turn that on if you don't have it. You can also set the location of custom fields. So all the custom fields on any form have to be displayed together in a group, but you can determine where within that form that group starts. So that's over here, display custom fields before the form field. So a lot of times, especially I see this on user custom fields, they end up way at the very bottom of the form. So you scroll through a bunch of stuff you don't care about on the user record, find your custom fields down at the bottom. If you want to move those closer to the top where your other critical fields are, this is where you do that. And then there's a form message. This is one of my favorite and probably least appreciated features. You can put all kinds of good stuff in this form message. So what you're seeing here on my screen is an example of how you can link to documentation on the form, so that every time somebody opens up this particular form, they see this message. For guidance on populating this form, download the user guide here. So this presupposes that you have a user guide, obviously, but any kind of documentation that you have that would be helpful, you can link to it. So if I click this link, it just takes me to the top step website. But of course you could link to anything. So as long as it's available, go ahead and link to it there. It's just any kind of HTML. you can add it here. We'll cover a couple other examples later on of how that can be useful. So that's it. Those are those role-based permissions. Common uses. Really, the key here is anything that's specific to one role and not another. So if you want to disable the Save button, if you want to make certain fields that you would consider for finance being responsible for populating, let's say on a project or on a user record maybe, you can make them read-only to other roles. You can also make them required for certain roles. So a finance field is a common example. If you have integration fields, external IDs, checkboxes to include or exclude records for integration, you can exclude those from other roles except for administrators, which I would recommend. I already mentioned the example of user custom fields, moving those higher up the form. And then the divider section before custom fields. So this is another maybe less realized feature. It's there. It's just often overlooked. So if you want all of your custom fields to show up in a divider section called custom fields, you would uncheck this here. If you check it, that divider section is hidden. So since I have it enabled on my form, I have a section on this form for custom fields. Right there at the top. By the way, otherwise, if you're not using that, the only difference would be if I disabled that. It's just I don't have this collapsible section, and I can't navigate it here on the left column. But all the fields are still there. You just lose the header. And then the form message tips. All right, let's talk about permission rules. These are more interesting. So I think more commonly, the kinds of changes you want to make to forms are not usually role-based. They're based on some other conditions. So permission rules, again, you find them within the form permissions, but they're a whole separate animal. And each rule will run in real time, which is one of the nice things about them. So as you change data on the form will change in real time. Each rule is comprised of conditions, an action, and a message. So these are the types of conditions that you can define. If you want to say, if a drop-down field has a particular value, it's going to recognize that's a drop-down field. Let's say project stage, for example. It's going to allow you to select the project stages to compare that against. So if the project stage is internal, etc. Text fields like record names, notes fields, things like that, you can compare them to defined text. Number fields, obviously, you're comparing the numbers, and dates to specific dates, which is a limitation. So think about this. If you want to compare a project date to today, let's say you have a field called actual project end date. You want that to be populated when the project is, let's say, moved to a closed stage. Well, if you wanted a permission rule that said, don't let somebody populate the actual end date in the future, you couldn't do that with a permission rule because you have to select a specific date to compare that against. You can't compare it against the date of today, for example. And then, of course, you can compare any field to any other field. So let's say if you wanted to say if the project name contains the customer name, things like that, or doesn't contain it. You can do that kind of evaluation. These are the types of actions available. So you can show a field, which seems kind of odd. Why would you want to show a field? Actually, what that does is if you create a rule that conditionally displays a field, what it means is if that condition is not true, then that field becomes hidden. So it's kind of the inverse of hiding. If you say, if project stage is internal, then show this field, what that means is if the project stage is not internal, then the field will be hidden. It's effectively the same thing as doing a hide action. It's just the reverse logic. You can make fields read-only. You can make fields required. Hide and clear is really valuable. So if you want to make sure that data is not entered, hide and clear will not only hide the field, but it will also clear any value that may have been entered before it was hidden. Limit values, we're going to look at some examples of where that's really useful. And then, of course, hiding buttons like save and delete. So we're going to look into some examples, but before we do, I just want to show you this layout if you haven't seen it. Again, I'm going to form permissions and then scrolling down to the section of permission rules. And if we go to create a new permission rule, these are those three sections. First, we define the conditions. If I say project owner, it's going to recognize who are the valid project owners, so it's a list of users here. If I want to compare instead of against owner start date, it's going to recognize that's a date field, so it gives me the option to pick a specific date. Or again, compare it to another date field. So those are the conditions. The actions are all available here. We'll look at examples of all of these. And then the third thing that I didn't cover is a custom message. So optionally, you can do this. And what this does is if these conditions are met, not only will it perform this action, which is required, you can also choose to display a custom message. So if you want to display an error or a warning or information, the only difference between those three selections is that an error shows up in red, a warning shows up in yellow, information shows up in, I think, green. So they could have called these green, yellow, red, but they didn't. They call them information, warning, error. But that's really the only difference. And then you can say conditionally display whatever message here. It's just going to put it at the top of the form conditionally. And again, we'll look at examples of that. All right, so let's jump into a couple of these. I find that just showing you how the feature works doesn't quite jog your creative ideas as much as showing you examples of where these might be useful. So what I've done is I've collected some of the more common and more useful examples of where we see customers using permission rules, so that maybe this will spark some ideas for how you can improve your forms. So this example here is showing you in a project, this is a company that has regions. So if they define regions on the project, you can have a different form layout for each region. So in a company with 4 regions, and each of those 4 regions manages their projects differently or tracks different fields or requires different fields, you can accommodate that with this region field. In this example, region is a custom field. So if the region is EMEA, or MEA, and the project stage is not internal, then this is going to hide several fields because EMEA does not care about Salesforce Opportunity ID. Maybe they're not using Salesforce, and they don't use these fields, referral, and they're not doing project level expense approvals. Right? So they don't care about those, so we're just going to hide them for the EMEA folks. Another example, really common if you have an internal project stage, usually those projects, you don't care about tracking the same fields as you care about your customer-facing projects. So if you just want a real simple form for your internal projects, get rid of all those forms that are cluttering up, the fields that are cluttering up the forms, you can do it this way. So if the stage is internal, hide a bunch of fields that you don't care about for internal projects. All right, so this is that example that I mentioned a minute ago. No, I'm sorry, we're going to get to that in a minute. So require an actual end date for closed projects. So before I said if we wanted to prevent the end date from being in the future, we couldn't do that, but here's what we can do is say if the project stage is closed or complete or however you define your project stages, then require this custom field called actual end date. And you'll notice this particular example, which we'll look at, includes a message. So what this means is if the conditions are met, if it's in one of these stages, then you'll also see a message at the top of the form that says closed projects must have actual end date populated. It's really just a reminder, if nothing else. So if I change the project stage to closed, now you can see there's this message that appears in real time at the top, closed projects must have actual end date populated. The message doesn't do anything. It's not a control in and of itself. It just displays. It's another optional action. This is not an error message. This doesn't keep me from doing anything. It's the permission rule itself that's going to require an actual end date. I have the actual end date field here. It's not populated, so if I try to save the record, that's when I'll see an error. Now it's showing me, hey, this is a required field. Okay, I'll put that as today, and then it'll let me save it. Great. Now, this is actually a really good example if you're not using this. This will enable you to run reports like, show me data for projects that ended last month. If you filter on this actual end date, this is the best way to do it. I would say probably the only way to do it. And in order to run reports like that to show data about projects that ended last month or last quarter or whatever, you want to be sure that that date gets populated, so this would be a great way to enforce it. All right, so here's one. In my example, I have a probability field. So this is for projects that are in the pipeline stage. They haven't really sold yet. We don't have signed contracts, so we're bringing over from Salesforce in this example the probability of close. Okay, well that's a ratio field, custom field in OpenAir, and so we don't want the ratio field to be greater than 1. OpenAir normally won't prevent that, so if we have 200%, it would normally let you do that. So this rule basically says if that probability field is greater than 1, then hide the save button and display that value. Probability must be between 0 and 1. So in some cases, you want to keep people from entering bad data. This is a way to do it. You can do things like ranking. If you have any number fields where you want people to do a 1 to 5, like a project health kind of a thing. Maybe you want a text field but prevent values greater than 5. Again, another way to do it. All right, so here's an example where you have you have different practices in your organization, and based on the practice, you have different service offerings. Okay, so you're conditionally limiting selections based on the selection of another field. Now, a lot of you know there's a different way to do this. You can relate drop-down fields so that if one is selected, then you have only specific selections that are available. However, there are some really important limitations with that. For example, you could only have a child selection can only be available in one parent in that other example. It can only be picked under one scenario. Here you can have some overlap. So if you have 2 practices that have the same service offering, this would allow you to do that where the other method would not. So this just says if the practice field is equal to support, then limit the values in service offering to these 2 support practices. You'll notice at the bottom in that limit value section on the bottom, there's some other service offerings that are available, integration, training, things like that, but those are not specific to the support practice, so we're just saying you couldn't pick them if the practice is support. All right, on the user record, I would say the most common use of this is employee versus contractor fields. The most simple example is an employee hire date. Maybe an employee number might be a better example. But this rule simply says if the user type, which is a custom field, is contractor, then hide the employee hire date or hide the employee ID, things like that. All right, in tasks, if you are entering a timesheet and you pick a task on a project, let's say the project has 20 tasks, there's nothing in that view that tells you whether the individual task is billable or not. So this is a way to basically say if you create a non-billable task, then you need to add non-billable in the task name so that when people enter their time on their timesheets, they can see, that's a non-billable task. That's It's one thing to ask people to do that as a matter of process and expectation, but this is a way that you could enforce it. So in this example, if the task name does not contain non-billable, but the non-billable checkbox is checked, then hide the save and also the save and create another button. So you wouldn't be able to save that task until you rename the task to include the word non-billable in it. Some of you are already thinking ahead and saying, well, what about the worksheet view? You're right. That would be a workaround. In the worksheet view, and we're going to talk about all the backdoors to enforcing permission rules to be aware of, it is true, the worksheet views do not enforce these permission rules. So here's another example of non-billable tasks. Let's say if the task is non-billable, we want to limit the task type selection to certain values that are associated with non-billable time. This example is trying to prevent the scenario where the task is checked non-billable, but you have a billable task type associated with it. This is just a way to prevent that by limiting values. All right. So those were fairly simple examples. I want to show you one example that can be really handy. If you have lots of fields on a form that you don't use very frequently and they're taking up lots of space, I'll show you just one little trick of how you can clean up your form a bit. So in this example, what I have is a section called Project Contacts right here. And by default, I really only associate one contact with the project on a normal basis. So most of the time, 9 times out of 10, that's all I want to populate is just one contact. This is actually a user lookup field. I made a mistake when I was setting it up. But let's say it's one person here, and that's it most of the time. But every once in a while, I'm going to want to add up to 6 more. If I check this box, then in real time it says, oh, okay, you need to show more. Here's more. Here's 2 through 7. And now with these, I can actually populate all of the rest of them if I want to, as many as I like. If I'm done with that and I want to collapse it, again, uncheck it, and it just hides it. Pretty simple, right? Let's take a look at how that rule is actually working. If I go to my permission rules here, I have this hide contacts rule. And I just created a custom checkbox field that says show more contacts. So if it's unchecked, then hide contact 2 through 6. Pretty simple. All right. Let's jump into scripting. Now, scripting is a fairly recent feature. They only announced this feature late last year, although technically it was available. There were a few customers who had been deployed using this feature before it was publicly announced. So it's not widely known and not widely used yet. First of all, it is JavaScript. There is no Suite script for those of you familiar with NetSuite. There's no custom script as of yet. Any kind of scripting you want to do in OpenAir so far will be with JavaScript. Now, given that, there are 2 methods that are types of methods in the JavaScript, standard and the SOAP API, and I'm going to talk about that. Before I talk about that, I'm going to give a big giant asterisk in front of this. For those of you who are not developers, which I would expect is most of you, if not all of you on this call, I am among you. I am not a developer. I do not write JavaScript. So if you want to use this feature, you need to have somebody on your team who does know JavaScript. In some cases, we have a few sample scripts that we use from time to time. We can share them with you and troubleshoot things like that. If you want to hack around and try them on your own, you're more than welcome to do so. I just recommend you do it in a sandbox account so that you don't interrupt production. So everything I'm about to cover regarding scripting is to give you a sense of what is possible and to give you an understanding of how it actually works if you wanted to consider deploying this and what might be possible. So let's talk about, first of all, the standard methods available in JavaScript, and then why it's different from the web APIs. So these are the kinds of things that you can do that are different from form permissions, or from permission rules. Now, first of all, this first bullet point here, evaluate data on save record, this effectively was the reason for JavaScript last year before they enhanced permission rules. Now that you can hide the save button, you can effectively prevent people from entering bad data. That was the big sell for JavaScript prior to that. But again, you can do that. In some cases, if you've got really complicated validations that a permission rule for some reason won't handle for you, that would be a reason you might want to look into JavaScript to do it. JavaScript can do some other things, though, that permission rules can't, one of which is check for missing attachments. So one example is if you want to require notes for receipts on expense reports if the attachments are missing. We do have a customer doing that. You can also compare dates dynamically. So you can compare a date against today. And that is that example I'd mentioned further of preventing entering future actual project and date. So you have to compare that date against today's date. And then the nice thing about JavaScript is when it does produce an error, you can put that error, you can define what the error text is, and you can also display that error text next to the actual field that you want to put it to. So you have more flexibility in how those errors are displayed. All right. Besides those, there are SOAP API functions. If you don't know what SOAP is, think of it as web services. So this is something that has to use the OpenAir API in order to work. Now, this is a new feature as of the last release, I believe, which is late 2013. And the message I got back from NetSuite so far is you do not have to have the API license access in order to take advantage of this feature. So if you're thinking already, well, that rules me out because I don't have API access because I don't pay for it, not a problem. You can still enable this. So this will do extra cool things that you can do with regular JavaScript prior to last release. Things like populate fields after save. So you save a record, and then you can have the JavaScript actually evaluate some data and then write to a field for you. The example that comes to mind is some companies will have a duplicate cost center field on user records because of the limitations with certain reports and cost center. So if you wanted to have a hidden cost center field for reporting on user cost center, you could hide it on the form, but then just populate it with a JavaScript. So populate your regular cost center on the user form, save it, don't worry about it, and then behind the scenes you have this custom field that's also being populated by the JavaScript. The other powerful thing you can do is evaluate data in related records. So the example in NetSuite's documentation for this is prevent closing a project with an open issue. So it'll look at all of the issues related to the project, see if any of them are still open, and then prevent the project from being saved in a particular project stage. Another interesting one that they listed in their examples in their documentation provided by NetSuite, which I'll show you in a second, is the ability to append notes fields. So think of the example of every time you save a project, to have a notes field that would automatically be appended with today's date and whatever today's notes were, so you don't lose any historical notes. Right? So the JavaScript would take care of the logic of what does the notes have previously, what did you just add, and then append it so you don't lose historical notes. So pretty powerful stuff. All right, so what does it actually take to turn this on and start using it? First of all, you have to request the internal switch. I think the switch off the top of my head is enable users to run scripts from form permissions. It's something close to that. If you tell them you want to use JavaScript or scripting, they'll know what you mean. You're going to write the JavaScript. This assumes you know JavaScript or someone you work with does. You're going to save it as a .js file. It's effectively a text file. You save it as a .js. I'll show you that. You're going to store it in a workspace and then add it to form permissions and test it. All right, so let's take a look at how that works. So here's the actual JavaScript that I've just saved to my desktop. So this script, you can see it's just a text file. I'm opening it in in Notepad. The only thing that makes it a JavaScript, obviously, is the syntax and the .js file extension. So when you save this, you just have to go save as instead of text. Just make sure you add .js. That's all there is to that. Then you're going to go to a workspace. I've created a workspace called scripts. I recommend you do that. And you put any JavaScripts here specifically. This one is already here from me looking at it earlier, so I'm going to delete it and start over. So I'm just going to create a document. Choose the file. It's on my desktop. Project date. I don't have to name it. This key tags is just a feature we have on in our sandbox. It allows you to search documents across workspaces, so if you're curious about how that works, feel free to reach out to us. And I'll just save it. So all I've really done is just added that .js document to the workspace. Okay. Now I'm going to jump back into my project and go into the form permissions. And down here toward the bottom, there's this section that shows up when you enable the internal switch to add a script. So when I add that, the first thing it does, this top section recognizes I only have one JavaScript saved in workspaces. Otherwise, if I had multiples, it would give me a drop-down of all the workspaces where the JavaScripts are stored, and then I'd be able to pick the actual script. I've just got one, so it's showing me that one. If you revise the document, you make changes to the script and update it with a revision, you can pick the revision here that is actually used, that's deployed on the form. The deployment options. So the event basically describes when do you want this thing to run. Do you want it to run after the document is saved? Do you want it to run before it's saved, which is going to be 99% of the time for you because you click save. Before it actually saves the record, it's going to evaluate the script, produce any errors, and prevent from saving if errors are produced. And then on submit, if the form has a submit button, the one that comes to mind would be a booking approvals. Most submit forms like timesheets and expense reports don't actually have form permissions on them. All right, so the entrance function, this is the most technical we're actually going to get in this example. It's actually called right out in the beginning of the form. It's called function project date. So I'm just going to copy and paste that here. Active script deployment means if I save this, it's going to actually run anytime the project form is saved. Okay, so for that reason, you want to be sure that you do this in your sandbox account first, test it, make sure it works right, then move it to production. Now this is really all I have to do at this point. If I save this now, it will go into effect. But there's another really nice option that your technical folks actually doing this may appreciate. If you want to troubleshoot these actual scripts, it gives you this little testing and debugging interface. So if I click load code from workspace, it's going to grab that actual JavaScript and present it in this little mini IDE here, so it's actually testing for errors. If I put some bad syntax here, it shows me, oops, you have an unnecessary semicolon. So if you have badly structured JavaScript or bad syntax, it's going to recognize that and call out some obvious stuff. Now, it's not going to tell you whether or not the script is a good script or will actually work the way you expect it to, or will produce the right kind of errors, things like that. It'll just call out JavaScript syntax errors for you. The nice thing is if you find some things wrong with this, you can make the changes on the fly and then click this Commit to Workspace button. So this will take any changes and fixes that I made to the script, and it will upload it and override it on that workspace document. So I don't have to go back and forth with Notepad and fix it and then reload it. This gives you can do all the changes you need in this environment. Makes it really simple for you. All right. Now, unfortunately, this is a sandbox account. As you may or may not know, there was a recent release last weekend in the sandbox accounts that we are testing, and something happened in there, and NetSuite support has assured me that they're working on it. It will be fixed very, very quickly, but due to bad timing, unfortunately, there is something that is preventing this from working in the sandbox, and I'm getting this error. So what we're going to do is, once that's fixed, I'm going to do a demo of this again, and we're going to splice it into this recording so that when this makes it into YouTube and our website, you'll actually be able to see this script working. So I apologize for now. Again, just bad timing. I can't actually show you the functionality, but it certainly was working earlier in the week. All right. So now that we've seen how everything kind of works or can work, let's talk about some general tips and tricks. So if you don't know where to start, maybe you're a new admin or you haven't really thought about form permissions before and you don't even know kind of what the state of things is, it's extremely common. What I would do is start with an audit of your current form permissions. And what I mean is just put a spreadsheet together, list out all the forms, and just go look at them. Note anything that looks bad or inconsistent, and just have a look. And keep in mind that every time you create a new role, that updates every single new form permission. I'll show you what I mean. So here in the project form, if I go to form permissions, all these role-based forms. So let's say I want to hide project location to this user role and the project manager role, but not to the administrator role. And then in the actual end date, I want to actually make that read-only to users, so that only project managers and administrators can control that. So I'm going to save those form permissions. Great, no problem. But then 6 months from now, I have some other business need to create a new role, because I've only got 3 and that's not really cutting it. So I'm going to create a new role, and I'm going to call it Finance. Oops. Okay, now I have a finance role. Great. I've set up the role the way I wanted it, but what I haven't done is gone through all these form permissions and evaluated what finance actually has access to on individual forms. So if I look here, you can see now there's a new column for finance, but this field that I wanted hidden to everyone except for administrators is now visible to finance. And this field that I wanted read-only to everyone except for project managers is now available to finance. So what can happen is over time you've added these roles, but you haven't gone back to look at, oh wow, all these hidden fields that I'm used to seeing hidden are actually visible to all these other roles, and I had no idea. So very common. That's why I recommend start with an audit, and you're looking for things like this, where you have a consistent either hidden or read-only for a particular field, and then to the right you have no form permissions. So you may have been asking in your head, well, that's great. How do I audit all of them? Here's a list of, I'm not going to say this is all of the forms with form permission, but this is at least 90% of them. There's probably a few here and there that we've missed, but this is a good list at least to get started with. Chances are, though, you're probably, if you have form permission set up, it's probably not, I'll say it's certainly not on all of these. It's probably on a much smaller list. So this is where I would start. Definitely your user records, projects, tasks, issues if you're using them, and receipts and bookings. I would start with those because they're the more commonly used forms. All right, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Watch out for backdoors. So this is workaround. This is a way for people to update data that bypasses the form permissions. Worksheet views. So there's three main worksheet views throughout the system: tasks, expenses, and bookings. If you're using these, that just means you're not taking advantage of the form permissions. So if it's absolutely business critical that tasks be structured in a particular way that's enforced by those permission rules, for example, then you may want to consider disabling the task worksheet. Now you're thinking, well, I love the task worksheet. It saves me lots of time. It's really a trade-off. You've got to decide what's more valuable. Is it these permission rules enforcing good data, or is it the worksheet that saves you time? It's really one or the other at this point. Same with expenses. We do have clients who have disabled the expense worksheet. It's tough to disable it if you've already got users using it and expecting it and loving it. Yanking it away from them is probably going to be a big challenge for you. But if you're a new customer or you're being, deploying soon, this is something to consider. Well, if they don't know it's there, maybe they won't miss it. Same idea with booking worksheet. The new multiple bookings form. So you may have noticed in a recent release, last year in 2013, they gave you the ability to disable this globally so that if users were using that, form permissions aren't enforced there, so you can turn that off. Updating records from the list view. The most common one is moving projects from one stage to the next. So if you move projects from, let's say, live to closed, and you have a permission rule that says when you move it to closed, you need to populate that actual end date. Well, this is going to be a backdoor around that. That end date is not going to be populated if people are doing this. If your question is, well, how can we disable that? The answer is you cannot, unfortunately. Same thing with bookings. So if you're modifying bookings to change the booking type, for example, and you have a permission rule that says if a booking type is X, then you cannot have this other field value of Y. Well, again, no way to prevent that. If you modify them in the list view, you're not going to enforce those form permissions. There is one small exception to that from the last release in November of 2013, which is if you have a permission rule on a booking that prevents them from deleting it, then they cannot delete the booking from the list view. That's the only exception so far. And then also user changes with the bulk user change wizard. Again, those aren't going to force those permission rules. So keep those in mind when you're setting them up. All right, I'll leave you with a couple final tips and tricks, and then we'll open it up for questions. I really like the use of using that form message with a link to user guides. I like to have a different user guide for each section, so maybe one for the user record, one for the project record, and maybe even a separate one for tasks. Just create documents. It can be even as simple as a screenshot that's annotated with little tips on how to populate certain fields. And you can store that screenshot as a document in the workspace and even reference that workspace document with a link. Billing rule form permission message with guidance. Let me actually show you what I mean by that. If you have people setting up billing rules, you can create a different form or a different message on each type of billing rule. So if I create a new time billing rule, and I just want a little message up here that reminds people, hey, remember, if you have a capped rule, follow this guidance. Whatever your process is, you want to be sure that people are entering these rules in a certain way. Just add a note up here and mark it red. It's easy enough to do. It's just a little bit of HTML to color the text, which I think is helpful for making it stand up. There's just a little HTML tag, font color is red, and that's all there is to it. So those little message form tips I think are very, very useful. And then custom field help text with links. Let me show you what this is. It's not strictly form permissions, but we're talking about cleaning up forms and making them more useful. So let me just show you. In custom fields, I have one in employee type. So in the hint text, I have referenced this actual link that just says help. and it's taking me to a shortened Google URL link. Let me show you what this actually does. In the user record, if I open up a user and I go to that particular field, I'll see a little link that says help right underneath the field. Right here, user type, employee, and then help. You'll notice that the link at the very bottom of my browser is going to take me to that Google URL, and it's a document. It's actually a document that I've stored in the workspace, but it can be any document anywhere. So imagine if this were taking you to just a quick screenshot that was annotated of, user type help. You could have a different help little pop-up form for any custom field just by populating the hint. Keep in mind the hint is limited in length, so that's why I had to shorten the URL so it would all fit here within the text. And before I jump on this slide and open it for final questions, I'm going to show you one last little tip, just for fun, which is, I've showed you the form message a lot. Here is kind of a fun little workaround that I've done. On the enter time form, you can actually do it on any form throughout the system, but there's actually a message. You can't do form permissions here, but you can customize the page and just add a message. So all I've done is I've just added a message, which is an HTML tag that just gives it a body background, which is kind of fun. So that's just a little bonus for kicks. So what I'm going to do now is open it up for questions and unmute everybody's lines and do my best to answer them. So let me see if I can unmute. Great, thanks for joining, and keep an eye out in future weeks for the fixed version of this with the actual live demo of the JavaScript. We'll get that up as soon as possible. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.